Welcome to Web Development Lesson 7.2. In this video, we're going to explore how we can create a filter function in order to extract specific pieces of information from a data set. In doing so, we're going to learn how we can create an empty array that we can then populate with just those pieces of information from the data set that meet our filter criteria. So let's get to it. So just as a little review, we're working with NYC Open Data's 311 service request calls, which is just a data set of various 311 calls that were made. That data comes to us as an array of JSONs, with each JSON having various key values such as complaint type, descriptor, incident zip, and burrow. So in a previous video, we saw how we can filter through this information. So let me show you the final outcome. So through those 1,000 entries, if we wanted to see just the complaints from Queens, we can type in Queens in a text input and then use that value to simply extract the complaints that come from Queens. We could do the same thing for the zip code because maybe we want something a little more narrow in our search. So we can see we got 9 complaints for that particular zip code. Or perhaps we want something a little more global, such as, what were all the noise complaints in New York City? And you can see here we're back up to 264. So how do we handle this? So we handled that by simply using an if statement. So we have our for loop that goes through the whole data set because we have an array of JSONs. We pulled the particular complaint from the array. And then we check that complaints, that JSON's key value, against the value that was provided by the user. So in this case, the key value was the burrow. So we're checking to see that the burrow of complaint matched the burrow that was passed into us. So again, we're checking the key value of the JSON against the value that was provided. Now we go to some of the other filter functions. You'll notice the code's essentially the same. The only thing that's really changing was that key value, that key from the JSON that we were checking against the value that was provided through the text input. If you go to filter by complaint, you'll notice the same thing again. The only thing that really changes here was the key in the JSON that we were checking and the value that we were checking against the user's text input. So what we're going to do here is we're going to refactor our code so that we don't have, separate functions that essentially do the same thing. So we're going to create one function filter that's going to be flexible enough to know, okay, I'm going to check against this key value and against this key in the JSON with this value. So in this particular video, we're extending from lesson 7.1. So I just want to review a little bit of what we have, which it's going to give us a lot of power in the sense that we don't have to redevelop this. So we have a function card, which accepts a JSON and actually builds the card. So in our process of refactoring this code that's very redundant, we're not going to have to duplicate this. Why? Because we already have a function that does that. We're also not going to have to replicate or refactor the concept of building the cards because we already have a function called cards that goes through an array of JSONs, takes the JSON, passes it to this function to produce the card. Now, just to kind of show you where this is being used, if you go to our init function when the web page first loads, we are able to show, S. Where's S coming from? I must have just typed that. All right, so let's get rid of that one. And you can see here we got cards for all 1,000 entries. And let me do this as well. Results. Is it results? Yes. Results.inner HTML is equal to. I'm just going to copy this real quick. And I'm going to simply use, even though we know that it's 1,000 entries, but essentially it's the length of the array. So let's just handle that so we get it to populate on the screen. And there we go. So we got our 1,000 results. So right now we have the exact same output that we had in the other one, except that we're using functionality we already have. which is the cards function that calls the card. So now what we're looking to do is we want to add this ability to filter through these specific keys in each JSON, given a value that's provided by the user. So let's go ahead and create that function. So we'll say filter. Oops, forgot the word function. Filter. And let's go over to our code and copy essentially the code that's required. So I'm not going to take care of this because this is going to be handled somewhere else. This is the basic code that does the job. So I'm going to do that here. And let's go ahead and get a little more space for the code. All right, so we need to be able to go through an array of JSON. So notice we had this variable data. I want to handle this a little bit differently in that I'm going to do the same thing we did up here for the cards function, that the cards functions accepted the array of JSONs. Remember, that's what we had here. So I'm going to replace data with complaints. Again, this will make more sense when we kind of do some other things to it. I'm also going to take this part out because we already said this code's being handled by the card function, so we're not going to duplicate that code. So now we're kind of left with this shell of a code to refactor. Now, if we leave this key value here, or burrow, that means this filter function will only work for the key value burrow. If we leave this value here, it's only going to work with the value of burrow. So what we need to do is we need to accept what key value we're looking for, what key we're looking for, and what value we want to compare that key to. So again, this is supposed to replace this, and this is supposed to replace this, so it becomes flexible. And again, this will make more sense when I tie it into the script file. So the value is pretty easy. We could simply just replace this. So whatever key from the JSON we're looking for, we want to compare it against the value. Now, it'd be nice for us to put the word key here. But the problem is that if we put the word key there, what's actually going to happen, it's going to look for a particular complaint that actually has a key value of key. Can't do that. Again, this is a variable. So at this point, we're going to use the other method of accessing a key from a JSON, which is use the square brackets. Again, in previous videos, I expressed my reluctancy to use the square brackets because the square brackets are traditionally meant to be used with arrays. But in this case, we have to use the square bracket notation because we need this to be interpreted as a variable, not as an actual key. Now, the square bracket with the key value inside will then actually become the key value that gets checked here. Again, that was a big mouthful. It'll make more sense once we actually go through it. Now, before I kind of complete this process, because again, at this point, you still might be feeling a little uncomfortable as to how this plays in these different values. So let's go to our script function and let's talk about what we're going to do on this side. So we've created a variable called subdata, because again, this is not the whole data set. The idea of filtering is that we get a small piece of the data set. So we're going to call the filter function. And the first thing the filter function wants is the data. Similar to like the cards function. Remember, the cards function wanted the array of data, the array of JSONs. So we're going to pass in that same array to filter. The next thing that filter wants is that particular key value that's going to be used here. So in this instance, now we're going to do burrow. Again, the burrow here represents the key value that we're going to use from each JSON. Now, the reason I'm making that distinction is because the next entry is burrow. Now, this burrow is the value that we're retrieving from the text input. So again, this is essentially the same functionality that we're doing here, where this burrow was the value from the text input, and this burrow was the key for the JSON. So again, that's the distinction between this burrow and this burrow. Now it happens to be that these are exactly the same. It'll be more apparent in the next filter. So by us doing this, we have now passed the array of JSONs, the key for the JSON, and the value to check it. All right, so let's go back to our helper function and let's finish this off. Because honestly, we haven't really returned anything yet. So what is it that we're looking to return? We want to return a new list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called list, and I'm going to make it an empty array, which is simply just to put the square brackets in there. So the job of this function is to go through all these complaints and check to see that that key value that was provided to us was, I keep saying key value, that particular key of the JSON matches the value that was provided to us. Now, if you remember, right now, key is going to get the value of, matter of fact, let me do this. This might make more sense so that we have it right in front of us. Okay, so this is where we're getting the information from the script. So complaints is going to equal to data, key is going to equal to Burrow, and value is going to equal to that value that came from the text input. So that's how these these parameters are getting their information. So if the complaint with this particular key value, this particular key matches the value that we provide, we're simply going to push that complaint into the new array, the new empty array. And what are we looking to push? Well, we're going to push that complaint. So we're going to take that JSON that we're getting from the data. If it matches the value, if that key matches the value, we're going to push that complaint onto the list. And then from here, we're simply going to return the list. Again, this might take a couple of times going through it. And then with some of the examples that we run, hopefully it brings it home as to the power of what this is doing. All right, so at this point, we've gotten the subdata, which will return to us a new array of JSONs with just those complaints where the Burrow matched the value that we provided. At this point, what we can do is we can do subdata.length to see how many of those JSONs made it into that new list. And instead of build like we had in the previous example here, what we can do is, well, guess what? The only thing left to do is produce the cards. So I'm going to call the card function, but this time I'm going to call it with this new list, this new array of JSONs of just the filtered JSONs. So let's take a look at that over here. And very good, we don't have any errors. And let's look for queens. And there we go. So these are just complaints from queens. Now it's the exact same output as we got over here, but the structure of our code is different. Again, so we've refactored the code, so we've created a filter function that handles that dirty business of filtering from the data set. Look how much cleaner our code looks. Now, the beauty about doing something like this is, look what we're going to do with the filter by zip. I'm actually going to, if you allow me, I'm going to copy this code, put it over here instead, so it makes us make a little less typing. And we're going to filter not by Burrow, but by incident zip. And we're going to provide the filter, the key that we're looking to look for, and the zip function. I mean, not the zip, the zip value that's coming from the text input. That's it. I don't have to do anything else. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And now let's go ahead and filter, let's say, by this particular zip code. And it happened to be just one complaint, and that was it. The noise complaint from that zip code. All right, so now let's handle the same thing for the complaint type. And hopefully at this point you can appreciate it's going to be essentially the same thing. Notice we haven't replicated the for loop. We haven't replicated the if statement. That filter function now is smart enough that based on, I'm just going to copy this. Based on the key for the JSON that gets passed in and the value that gets passed in from the text input, the filter function has all it needs in order to complete its job. So let's just check out the last one, and let's look for noise residential complaints. And there we go. So we had 204 different noise residential complaints across all of New York City. So again, these values get passed into the filter function, which then is able to do its job. And because we provided values through parameters, the filter function was flexible enough that it can accept any key for a particular JSON and check it against the value to produce a new list of just those JSONs that meet that particular criteria. So I definitely suggest, if you get a chance, to play around with some other data sets and try this filter function on those. So let's go back to our presentation and review what we've done. So in this video, we had a chance to practice refactoring and also see the power of modular programming by using functions to, kind of encapsulate a process. We saw that we could create new arrays by just simply using the square brackets, and we can use the push function in order to add new elements to an array. So hopefully you're excited about being able to filter data using these functions that were created in this video, and enjoy.